What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I know it has been a while since I've uploaded, and I apologize for that. Life has been super busy these last few weeks, and it has just kind of gotten in the way of the channel. It is what it is. But with that out of the way, this video is going to be my preview and prediction of the Georgia versus Oregon game coming up in week 1. Now, my goal is to make 3 of these videos a week, these prediction-style videos, and then a recap video after each weekend, just to kind of cover everything that happened that weekend in college football. But we'll see how it all actually plays out. I'm not going to make any promises. We'll have to see how it works. I mean, I literally just recorded this video for like 35 minutes or whatever it ended up being, and then the audio file failed. So now I get to re-record it, which is fine. It's fine. But let's go ahead and get into this game for the second time now. So just a quick intro to this game. These are 2 very interesting teams that are in very different places as programs heading into this upcoming season, with Georgia coming off their first national title game in over 40 years, and Oregon entering a season with a brand new first-time head coach, and that head coach just happens to be Dan Lanning, Georgia's defensive coordinator from the last couple of years as well as last season, which adds even more intrigue to this game. As there's the whole media storyline of, does Dan Lanning's intimate knowledge of the Georgia program and roster and defensive scheme affect the game, and if so, by how much? And then on the other side of that, how does Kirby Smart's knowledge of Lanning as a coach and as a person impact the game on the other end? That, to me, is more of a media storyline, not something that has really clear, tangible impacts on the field. So I'm mostly going to gloss over that now. It is more important in this game than in a lot of others, and I'll talk about that later. But it is more of just an interesting talking head point than it is a impactful on the field event. So let's go ahead and look at the stats for these 2 teams. Now, normally I would want to use stats from this season just to keep it as relevant as possible, but in week 1 that obviously just isn't feasible, and really for the first couple of weeks of the season it's not too terribly feasible until you get a couple good games of data. So for now, we're just going to be going off of last year's stats for both teams, despite the obvious potential for some incongruities to arise there, as they are just 2 different teams than they were last year. Oregon, in particular, is a much different team than they were last year. Entirely new coaching staff, new quarterback, etc. So, looking at some of these offensive stats, Georgia had 38.4 points per game, which was 10th. Oregon had 31.4, which was 42nd. So off the bat, you can already see Georgia had the better offense of the 2, just in pure scoring. Passing-wise, Georgia at 252 a game, 51st in the country. So not anything crazy on the raw passing yardage totals. But as you can see there, 39 passing touchdowns, 12 interceptions, not bad, but a little high considering how few attempts Georgia really had. But the interesting number to look at here is the passing efficiency ranking. Now, that sort of accounts for the fewer attempts and sort of tells you how efficient you were per attempt, relative to who you're playing, things like that, to give you a more true ranking of how good the passing offenses were. You can see Georgia ranked 4th in the country there. So really, Georgia was a very good passing offense for what they sought to do. They weren't putting up the gaudy numbers that an Ohio State or an Alabama was, but they were getting the job done. They were a very efficient offense. When they needed to throw, they could, and that was the real way that the offense worked. They weren't a throw-first offense by any means, but when they had to throw, they were very good at it, and you can see that really by looking at that 4th in passing efficiency. 10th in points per game, they're clearly doing something right. On the flip side, though, you look at Oregon, another team that also didn't try to pass very much, but more so because they weren't able. They only had 20 passing touchdowns on the season, 8 interceptions, which isn't too bad, but again, low attempts kind of skews that. 220 yards per game, 76 in the country with that. So not very good. Mind you, Georgia wasn't either, but again, Georgia makes up for it with how efficient they were. If you look at Oregon's efficiency, 62nd in the country. So not atrocious by any means, but not very good either, especially relative to Georgia's number 4 ranking in passing efficiency. So something that is really interesting to look at and keep an eye on. Now, a lot of that is not going to be incredibly relevant heading into this year. We think. We don't know how relevant it will really be, because Bo Nix is taking over at quarterback. That completely changes things. He wasn't there last year. He transfers in. That completely changes how things work. And then you also have Kenny Dillingham taking over as the offensive coordinator, so the entire scheme is completely different. They're probably, from what we've seen, they're probably going to be a little more pass-heavy than they were last year, a little more tempo-heavy, and try to be more creative to create some more explosives, because that was the big issue last year. They could not create explosives on offense. I mean, they were just a very vanilla, very predictable offense. Really, a lot of the things that plagued Georgia at the elite level of the sport plagued Oregon at the very good level of the sport, where they were just really struggling to do a lot of things, that they needed to be able to do on offense to get big points. Struggling to hit those big explosives, struggling to pass when they absolutely have to versus passing when they want to. If they got into a third and very long, they were kind of, hand-tied because there wasn't much they could do there. Now, one thing that Oregon's offense was actually really good at was running the ball. Now, if we look at Oregon's rushing stats here, 202 rushing yards per game puts them at 24, 36 rushing touchdowns, very good. Lots of rushing touchdowns. That's a crazy high number. Only 6 fumbles lost. And really, if you look at the offensive line, it echoes the same sentiment. 12th in tackles for loss allowed versus 36 in sacks allowed. Really, 36 in sacks allowed is not awful. It's not outstanding, but it's really not that bad. And comparable to the rest of their passing stats. You can't blame the offensive line for what their offense was passing the ball. There was a lot of scheme issues, but there was a lot more quarterback issues at Oregon. That was the real limiting factor on their passing offense. You can't put it on the offensive line necessarily. They weren't great, but they weren't the real problem. And like the entire offense, they were much better running the ball than they were passing the ball. 12th in tackles for loss allowed. And they were a very good running team. Georgia, similar. Now, their offensive line was even better. 6th in sacks allowed, 3rd in tackles for loss allowed, which Georgia fans really thought they took a step back on the offensive line last year, which is kind of tells you what their offensive line had been of late, when 6th and 3rd are considered to be steps backward. But really they were, honestly. Their guard play in particular was not what it once was at Georgia, and it kind of shows just how good the offensive line expectations at Georgia are and really should be. But again, 6th in sacks allowed, 3rd in tackles for loss allowed, a very strong offensive line at Georgia. I expect that to carry over into this year, maybe even a better offensive line this year. Their guards look very good. They return almost everybody there. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that offensive line looks. I think it's going to be a very strong unit. Running the ball, they had 191 yards a game, 36 in the country, 29 rushing touchdowns, same 6 fumbles lost. So a few less rushing touchdowns, but it makes sense when they had almost double the amount of passing touchdowns, and then you can really start to see why Georgia averaged a touchdown more per game than Oregon did. And very good running team. They were a run-first team. Not quite as good as Oregon in some ways, but also they were a much better passing team than Oregon in a lot of ways. So their offense was just better than Oregon in most all of the main categories, except for third down percentage. Now, I know I mentioned Oregon, if they got into 3rd and long, they kind of had their hands tied. But somehow, despite how limited that offense was, they were the 3rd best third down offense in the country last year, hitting over 51% on third down conversion rate, which is absurdly high. I mean, that is ridiculously high for an offense that doesn't have much of a passing game to speak of. To be able to hit over 51% on third downs is crazy because, like I said, you get into a 3rd and 7, you're going to have to throw for it 9 times out of 10. And with an offense that can't throw well, you don't expect them to do good. But, man, they were outstanding. Now, Georgia was very good as well, not quite as good at 44, really 45% of the time hitting. And that was one of the big areas that Georgia struggled in, and Oregon struggled in as well, like I said, the explosives. If you get behind schedule on offense, neither one of these teams were outstanding at manufacturing points regardless of that. Georgia was better at it than Oregon, but Oregon was really, really struggled if they got behind schedule offensively. And I think that's going to be true in a lot of ways again this year and will be a really big factor in this game in particular. Looking at red zone percentage, the two teams were basically identical. Neither one of them were very good, hitting it about 84% of the time they hit the red zone they score. And for two teams that are as good as they are running the football and as good as these offensive lines were, to be in the 60s and ranked in the 60s nationally and red zone percentage is pretty disappointing, to be honest. But we'll see if they can improve on that this upcoming year. Just a little interesting stat. I don't know if it's going to be too incredibly important in this particular matchup. Time of possession, not much to talk about there. Georgia was slightly better, but it's by a minute. Neither one of them has anything like a major advantage or disadvantage in time of possession. But the big takeaways here on the offensive side of the ball is going to be that new-look Oregon offense under Kenny Dillingham. What does that really look like, and how effective is it going to be, particularly here in Week 1 with a new quarterback, an entire new system? Going to be very interesting to see. Now, I expect it to be improved. If they can take that passing efficiency and go from 62 to maybe 30 or 32, that's really all they need to do from a season-wide perspective. Now, in this game, they may need better than that. But just on a season-wide perspective, they were still a very good team record-wise with this offense last year. And trust me, the defense didn't look great either. We'll get to that. But they really don't need to improve dramatically and make a top 10 or a top 5 offense on the passing side of the ball. As long as they can keep their running numbers comparable, which I think they'll probably dip. I mean, they do lose Travis Dye in the transfer portal and things like that, and just by virtue of throwing the ball more and changing up things to be a little more explosive, you're going to have less rushing success. At least, less rushing attempts. Your yard per attempt would have to go up. Don't need to get into all of that, but they're an interesting offense this year because it's so much unknown, and they really need to get better on the passing side. They can't be 76th in passing yards per game, 62nd in passing efficiency, and really hope to have a shot in big games like this most of the time. Now, Bo Nix, I think, is a improvement for them at quarterback for sure. I don't think he's a Heisman quarterback by any means, but he's an improvement over what they had. And that's really not saying too much, but I think he's going to be a very good quarterback for them, especially as he works into some of his latter years at this point. I also think Dillingham is an improvement for them at offensive coordinator, and I expect to see some innovation there. Again, it's just how much of that is really going to take hold in Week 1 that is going to be the big tell there for the Oregon offense. Now, for the Georgia side of things, what is the Georgia offense going to look like with another year of Stetson Bennett here? It'll be his first year as the starter from jump all the way through. No JT Daniels issues, none of that stuff. It'll also be, I think, Monken's third year as offensive coordinator. And Georgia's not a team that's had the luxury of returning offensive coordinators very often. I mean, they had Jim Chaney for a couple years, and they had Coley for a year there, and it just never has really meshed perfectly on the offensive side for Georgia. Monken has really done the best job of any of them so far, and he's been there for, I think Chaney was only there for 3 years as well. So he's now been there for just as long as any of the other ones have under Kirby Smart. And it's going to be really interesting to see what that offense looks like with him calling the shots in another year. Much more continuity there than on the Oregon side. And the other big thing is Georgia's tight end room. They are all freaks of nature. You have 3, maybe 4 guys that are all going to be playing on Sundays, and Brock Bowers, Eric Gilbert, Darnell Washington. The freshman Oscar Delp, 5-star recruit, looks outstanding as well. How do they utilize them? They need to get as much out of them as they can because the receiver core, while good, they have guys like A.D. Mitchell and Karis Jackson and Ladd McConkey and all. The receiving core is not the strength of the team by any means. So how do you leverage that tight end talent at the same time? Be very interesting to watch as well there. So now moving on to the defensive side of the ball and seeing where we stand there. So Georgia's defense last year was historic. And a lot of this is going to be interesting, particularly to this game, because like I said, Dan Lanning, Georgia's defensive coordinator last year, Oregon's head coach this year. So how much of the Georgia side is going to carry over to the Oregon side will be really interesting to keep an eye on. Now, I think it is important to note Kirby Smart, as the head coach of Georgia, is a defensive head coach, so a lot of credit has to go to him regardless. They also have guys like Will Muschamp and Glenn Schumann who are going to be calling the defense this year that were there last year that are really important to note. And the biggest factor of all of this as well was just the absurd talent on the Georgia defense last year. That is the biggest factor here. So while Lanning has an important part to play on the Georgia numbers here, I don't think you can just look at the Georgia numbers and be like, yep, that's going to translate to Oregon right away because Lanning, Not exactly how that works. There's a lot more moving parts there that are unique to this situation. But I do think to some extent you can expect certain aspects of it to transfer, which we'll get into. So Georgia's defense averaged up, allowing 10.2 points per game, which was first in the country by a good bit. They also allowed only 190 passing yards a game. That's 13th. They had 16 interceptions. That's 8th. And they were the second most efficient passing defense in the country. They were really not a better defense out there. There just wasn't a better defense in general out there than Georgia last year. Georgia's defense, like I said, was historic. One of the best we've seen in many, many years at this point. So how much of that can Lanning carry over looking at the Oregon stats from last year? And man, do they need some help. They allowed 27 points per game. That puts them at 75th. 241 passing yards per game. That's 88th. They were really good at interceptions for some reason. It really doesn't make sense because they were also very good at fumbles as well. They had 17 interceptions. That's even more than Georgia had. That's 5th in the country. For a team that struggled really bad in the passing game, and if we will get to the sack number as well, but were horrible at putting pressure on the quarterback. How they got 17 interceptions, I really don't know. But hey, maybe they can replicate that. A huge point of success for them last year defensively. And then overall, their passing efficiency defense was 41st. That's not horrid. It's not very good either, though. And it's definitely something that I think Dan Lanning can walk into day one and improve by a wide margin. The interception numbers notwithstanding, he can definitely improve those passing yards allowed. The points per game, hopefully he can improve as well. And just your general passing efficiency defense, I think he will also be able to improve that. The big one that I know for a fact he will be able to improve, though, comes up next, and that is sacks. If you look at Georgia, they had 49 sacks. They were 7th in the country. Oregon was horrid. 23 sacks, 104th in the country. That is inexcusably bad for a team with as much talent as Oregon has on the defensive side of the ball. Because there is talent there. Justin Flo, Noah Sewell, they have talent there, particularly at the linebacker spot. And to only put up 23 sacks it's inexcusable. It's abysmal, honestly. And that is something Dan Lanning is known for. Manufactured pressures, he is outstanding at. Even if he doesn't have guys that are going to win their one-on-ones, he manufactures pressure with the absolute best of them. And while Georgia's defense hasn't always been some outstanding defense for getting sacks, last year they were particularly good. Now, they had some freaks of nature up front last year, but Lanning has always been able to do much better than what Oregon put on the field last year, and that carries over to tackles for loss. 110th in the country in tackles for loss was Oregon's defense. Georgia's was 37th. A lot of that is just due to the way they played the run. They weren't focused on committing bodies to the run because they knew they were good enough to just match up hat on hat and stop teams from running the football. They were allowed to focus on the pass game because they knew they had guys like Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt and Trayvon Walker. They could allow 1 and 2 yard rushes because their defense was just not focused as much on that. Oregon at 110th is, again, completely inexcusable. How they were that bad at getting in the backfield and getting tackles for loss completely eludes me. I don't know, but it's another thing that Dan Lanning is great at doing. His defenses play behind the offensive line of scrimmage all the time. That is what they do. They fabricate pressure. They get in the backfield. That is what his defense is predicated on. I think immediately, regardless of players and talent and all that stuff, he will walk in day one, and those two things will be dramatically improved. And as a result, your passing yards per game, your points allowed, your efficiency will also go up as you increase your sacks and stuff like that. On the run defense side, 53rd is not horrible, but it's not very good, especially for what Lanning's coming from at 79 yards per game with 2nd in the country, to go to double that just about at 144 yards per game and 53rd in the country. Both teams recovered 5 fumbles, just kind of fluky stuff, but again, more evidence that Oregon's a very good defense for forcing turnovers. But the rushing defense, similar to the passing defense, I expect Lanning to get in there and fix a lot of that early. Now, on the Georgia side of this equation, they lose an immense amount of talent on defense. They do. They lose Nakobe Dean and Quay Walker and Channing Tindall and Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt and Trayvon Walker and Adam Anderson. And they lose a lot of people. That's not even touching the back end. But they also bring a lot of people back, like a Jalen Carter and a Nolan Smith. And there's a lot more that I could go through that I don't need to, because you should know at this point, Georgia's defense is absolutely stacked with talent. Now, the issue is going to be leadership and experience. Now, Nolan Smith, proven leader, very experienced. Same with Jalen Carter. Beyond that, though, you're missing leadership, particularly at positions like the linebacker spot. I expect Dumas Johnson to do very well there, but he's not Nakobe Dean yet. So there's a lot of questions about Georgia's defense to some extent, but even if they take a significant step back, they're going to go from, the first best defense to the fifth, the 10th maybe? They're still going to be an elite defense. I mean, talent-wise, they're probably still the most talented defense in the country, maybe Alabama or something like that, so put them third at the worst in talent-wise on defense. Coaching-wise, they're, again, top 3. The issue is only going to be experience, and that's going to be key here in Week 1 particularly, but that defense is going to be very, very good once again. So while I expect Lanning to boost Oregon's defense a good bit just by him getting there and coaching it up, I do expect Georgia's defense to take a step back. I still think Georgia's defense is going to be a noticeable notch above where Oregon's defense is going to be at next year. I just don't foresee them having an equally matched defensive game or anything like that. As good as Lanning is, I don't think he's going to be able to manufacture that overnight there in Oregon. Now, another big thing that Lanning is going to have to solve immediately, and that is third down defense. My God, Oregon's third down defense is bad. 118th in the country. They allow third down conversions almost half of the time, 46% of the time. For reference, Georgia, not outstanding on third down defense last year, at 35% of the time. Rounded up, call it 36% of the time. That's a 10% gap. That's huge. That's huge on third down defense. Oregon's third down defense was terrible. And you know why? No tackles for loss, no sacks. So their third downs were usually short because they weren't creating any negative plays. That is incredibly important as a team, but particularly in this game because Georgia's offense, like I mentioned, one that has to stay on track, has to stay on sync. If you can create negative plays for Georgia's offense, you have a much, much better chance of preventing them from scoring than if you just play defense and hope they don't score. By not creating negative plays. You play on your side of the ball and let Georgia come to you, you're going to have problems. Oregon last year was incapable of playing on the other side of the ball. They could not do it. Lanning is outstanding at that. That's what he does. So to what degree he fixes that is going to be huge in this game, and that's going to really help that third down defense because they cannot be 118th in the country again on third down defense. It's inexcusable. It's terrible. Red zone defense is just as bad. 87% of the time opponents scored in the red zone against Oregon. That puts them at 95th in the country. For comparison, let's look at Georgia. Now, mind you, Georgia's red zone defense was absurd at 62.5% of the time. That's crazy. That's obscenely good. But that was a Lanning-led defense. And then, mind you, I know the talent and all the other factors, but still a 25% gap between Georgia's defense in the red zone and Oregon's defense in the red zone. That's massive. That is absolutely massive. Lanning's going to improve that dramatically. Georgia's defense probably is going to take, again, a small step back. But, man, there's a lot of work to be done on this Oregon defense. And Lanning has his work cut out for him. Turnover margin, Oregon was better than Georgia because, again, Oregon just forced more turnovers. And if you remember on the offensive side, they threw less interceptions, things like that. But, again, that doesn't say too much about this year. Defensive touchdowns, Georgia had 4. That was very good at 7. Oregon only had the 1. Those aren't going to be too consequential in this game because it's hard to look like, I had 4 defensive touchdowns last year. That means I'll get 1 against Oregon this year. It's not how that works. It's not a transferable stat like that. But again, things like getting sacks and getting pressure on the quarterback, good for defensive touchdowns. But the big one here that I want to talk about, penalties per game. I know it's not as specific to defense stat, but this is just where it fit. Georgia, not amazing at a little over 5 penalties a game. That's 29th in the country. That's not great, but it's not bad. Oregon was terrible at almost 7.5 penalties a game, 112th in the country. Again, completely inexcusable. That is terrible. That will get you beat, particularly when you're terrible at defense already. When your third down defense is 118th in the country and you can't get off the field, then you finally do and you get a 15-yard penalty. That stuff kills you. When your offense, like Oregon's was, is predicated on staying on schedule and running the football, a 10-yard holding penalty can completely shut the drive down. Penalties for Oregon's style of play last year, and I think it's going to be very similar this year, already loom larger than they do against like an Ohio State, for example, who is an explosive team. They also were one of the worst in the country just on a per-game basis. They cannot do that again this upcoming year, particularly in the game against Georgia. If they have 7.5 penalties against Georgia, they are going to be in a mess. They cannot do that kind of stuff. Similarly, net punting. Georgia, pretty good at net punting, 41.5 yards per punt. Oregon, horrid, 103rd in the country. By the way, Georgia was 25th. Oregon, 103rd in the country, 37 yards in net punting. That's awful. That's field position battle that you're just losing just off of punting. You add in the penalties, you add in not being able to get off the field on third down, poor red zone defense. These things stack very quickly, and you can quickly see why Oregon's defense allowed 27 points per game, why their offense struggled to score like they did. And it's a team that had a good record, but as I dive into the stats individually, it looks rough. I did not think Oregon's defense was this bad statistically, and I didn't think they were this bad on things like penalties, punting, like special teams and penalties and stuff like that. Did not think they were going to be this bad. But how much of that carries over with Dan Lanning? I think a lot of your defensive woes can be fixed. Now, they're not going to jump to what Georgia's were, but they can be fixed. The question is things like penalties. First-year head coach, I'm not super confident he's going to improve the penalty thing a whole lot. Punting, that's hard to predict year to year, but you got to get better at that. And so it's going to be interesting. There are some huge red flags here for Oregon that I think could really, really make a difference in the game. But the big takeaways here, like I said, can Lanning fix Oregon's defense? That's the biggest one. And if so, to what extent and how quickly can he do it? End of year Oregon is probably going to have a much better defense than the beginning of the year Oregon. The same is true of Georgia, but for different reasons. So that's the big thing. The other big takeaway is just kind of how bad Oregon's defense was at very particular things last year, like rushing the passer, that I just don't think most people know, at least on the national scale. Maybe Oregon fans already know all about this stuff, but to me, outside looking in at Oregon, I thought, their defense is probably pretty good. I was not expecting to see, when I was making this compilation of these stats, to see 75th, 88th, 104th, 110th, 118th, 95th, like that. Bad. Not like kind of bad. So that's another large takeaway here, and it goes hand in hand with the Lanning thing. How much can he fix that? For Georgia, the takeaways here, does that defense take a step back? Yes, it's going to. Particularly in week one, it's going to. There's just not the experience to put out what they put out last year, this early in the year. The question is, how big of a step back? I think it'll be noticeable, but I do not think it's going to be something that puts them so far back that they're on Oregon's level defensively, even with the Lanning boost. I just don't see it happening. Losing Lanning for Georgia, I don't think hurts them as much as some people may expect, just because they have Kirby Smart, they have Will Muschamp, they have Glenn Schumann, and they have obscene amounts of talent on the defensive side of the ball. That's not what's going to hurt them. It's just losing the amount of experience they did. By the end of the season, I think Georgia's defense will probably be top 2 or 3 in the country. Early in the season, they'll probably be in the top 10 range. So still very, very good, just not quite what they were. And then the other thing, I already touched on it. Does the new defensive coordinator matter? I don't really think it does. I mean, Kirby is always very involved here. So that's there. Will Muschamp's a proven coordinator. Glenn Schumann has been with Georgia for a long time. He's a very proven coach. I think Georgia's defense is going to be just fine, honestly, especially from a coaching perspective. So again, those are your big takeaways there. Biggest one has to be, what can Lanning do with the Oregon defense? So that brings us straight into the key matchup section. So these matchups are going to be broken up as, most important for each team sort of thing. It seems kind of obvious, but you'll see as we go. So number one matchup for Georgia is going to be their new look defense against Bo Nix. This is the most important matchup on the Georgia side of the ball. Does the inexperienced defense struggle with a very experienced mobile quarterback like Bo Nix? They have a good history against Bo Nix in the past, but that was A, with Lanning calling the shots, but B, that was a different Bo Nix with a different team and different scenarios, and what does that really mean going into this game? It's hard to tell. And again, the experience factor is the issue for Georgia. It's not the talent factor, it's not the depth factor, any of that. It's just the experience. So week 1 is going to be where you're going to see a lot of those issues. So what is that going to look like with Bo Nix? I think it's going to look pretty good for Georgia. Now, I don't think they're going to shut Bo Nix down by any means, but this is a matchup that's going to be really important for Georgia to win, and is really going to be one that they're going to want to focus on. Probably the biggest one, because it's the biggest unknown for them. It's just, what is that new look defense going to look like? Second big matchup for Georgia is the tight end room. I already touched on them. They are a matchup nightmare for anybody who goes up against them. I don't think anybody in the country has an answer for Georgia's tight end room. I particularly don't think Oregon does. How does Georgia deploy that? Do they do a 4 tight end set or a 3 tight end set? Do they just rotate the tight ends? Do they play them at wide receiver? Do they play them at H-back? What are they going to do with them? A lot of potential there. How are they going to utilize that against in week 1 particularly? But how are they going to leverage that huge advantage that they have in just having freakish tight ends? That'll be really interesting to see. And then on the other side of that, how does Oregon deal with it? How does Dan Lanning deal with it? He's a very smart defensive mind. He knows those tight ends well. How does he try to, work against that? Definitely the second biggest matchup for me. And then the last one, Dan Lanning factor. Just to what extent does his intimate knowledge of the Georgia defense matter? So he knows the scheme incredibly well. He's called it for years. He knows the players incredibly well. He recruited and coached almost all of them. And he's very familiar with a guy like Bo Nix, so he knows what Georgia may target against him, and Bo Nix is familiar with Georgia as well. So you put those two together versus a very inexperienced Georgia defense, there is some potential there that becomes a bigger deal than it might normally would be. Normally a former coordinator going up against a new team, or going up against his old team when he's a new head coach, doesn't really matter all that much. This one, it could be more important than normal. Also, on the other side of that Dan Lanning factor, how much does Kirby knowing him matter? But on the bigger side of that, how much does him being a first-time head coach hurt Oregon? Does he handle the game management things correctly? Does he keep the culture good? Things like that. I expect him to do well, but you never know. It's a huge game to be coaching your first ever head coach, doing your first ever head coaching job in. It's a huge game, so you never know what that's going to look like. Those are Georgia's big 3 matchups. For Oregon, the first one, lines of scrimmage. Both of them. Huge to them. If Oregon is going to have a hope in this game, they have to be competitive on the line of scrimmage. They don't have to win them, because frankly, I don't think they're going to be able to win them, but they cannot let Georgia's offensive line maul them off the ball and run for 5, 6, 7 yards a carry. They'll lose. They cannot let Georgia's defensive line maul them and give Bo Nix no time to throw the ball and not establish the run. They'll lose. They have to be good enough to give Bo Nix time to throw, good enough to establish the run at least a little bit, and good enough to affect Georgia's offense. They have to be able to get some pressure on Stetson Bennett. They don't have to sack him 5, 6, 7 times, but get some pressure on him. They have to be able to create some negative plays for Georgia's offense. Keep Georgia's offense out of sync. That happens through the lines of scrimmage. It's something Oregon's defense was horrible at last year. They have to be able to do it in this game. The second one, improved defense. It goes hand in hand with the lines of scrimmage one, but how improved is their defense? I have a question mark there for a reason. It's a huge unknown. What is Oregon's defense going to look like under Lanning? They have the talent, particularly at linebacker, which Lanning loves and is outstanding at working with linebackers. Noah Sewell and Justin Flowe are going to shine under Lanning, particularly long term. How improved are they going to be, though, and how quick is it going to happen? How is it going to match up with that Georgia offense? What is he going to do with the tight ends? Things like that. Very, very, very important. Oregon's defense has to be improved, particularly on the sacks and tackles for loss, creating negative plays up front. They have to be improved. Next one, team chemistry against adversity. Now, this one's more of an intangible one, but the big thing here is when you're a new head coach, one of the hardest things to do is to build a strong culture and build good team chemistry. Much more difficult, really, than scheming and calling plays is, honestly. And I think it's something that goes underappreciated in a lot of ways. Now, I think that Dan Lanning is going to be very, very good at this. Do not get me wrong. I'm confident in him. But this is a really tough matchup. It's your first game as a head coach. You have to go in Atlanta, that's a home game for Georgia. It's a road game for Oregon. I know it's a neutral site. It's a road game. So you have to go on the road in Atlanta, play the defending national champion, very, very good Georgia team with a noticeable roster advantage, the team you just coached at as well, and try to go up against that. That is a very tough ask. Like, man, do you want to be a head coach? Because that's a tough lineup right there for your first head coaching matchup. I think Lanning's going to do good, but when you run into problems with these new staffs and all is when you start to face a lot of adversity, when you get a couple losses or in the flow of the game, if they get behind and things like that, do they start to stress? Do they start to turn on each other? Things like that. Very, very important that Lanning manages that perfectly for this game. So I think those are the big key matchups here, which takes me straight into the turning points for the game. Turning point 1 for Georgia. Now, real quick, these turning points are things that if they happen, then the team that they're on the side of is going to do much better. So, like for Georgia, if the offense is in sync, Georgia is going to look very, very likely to win this game. And that's because, and the reason I have this number 1, is because if Georgia's offense is in sync, I don't think Oregon has a shot. Because Georgia's offense in sync is when they're able to run the ball for 4+ yards a carry every single down, and that's first downs. They can throw when they want to, they can take shots when they want to, and they dictate everything. If Georgia can do that, I don't think Oregon has a prayer, because if they can do that, they're going to get to 40. And if they get to 40, I don't think Oregon's offense is going to be able to get near that. So Georgia's offense being in sync, huge turning point of this game. If Oregon cannot create negative plays, then they're going to have a long night. Turning point 2 for Georgia, lines of scrimmage. I know I mentioned it as a matchup for Oregon. The reason it's there as a matchup for Oregon is because if it goes Georgia's way in a large way, so if Georgia dominates on either or both lines of scrimmage, things are going to look ugly quick. Because if they can maul them up front for Georgia's offensive line, the offense will be in sync. 40 points, Oregon's out of the game. If Georgia's defensive line can maul Oregon's offensive line, Bo Nix has no hope. He has no chance. And if you don't give Bo Nix a chance to throw the ball, you're not going to be able to put up enough points to win the game. Georgia winning the lines of scrimmage would, and not like a little bit. If it's close, then that's a different story. But if Georgia dominates the lines of scrimmage, things are going to get ugly quickly. And the final point, I could have made this something like a talent advantage or just depth or things like that, because Georgia does have a general roster advantage. But I didn't want to go that way. I wanted to go the more intangible win here, and that is Lanning getting overwhelmed. Now, again, I'm not predicting this to happen. I don't think Lanning will end up this way. But if turning point 1 and 2 kind of start to happen, you could see Lanning get into a position where he's in a really high-stress situation, outmatched, in a really tough matchup, and you could see him start to get a little overwhelmed, lose his culture a little bit, lose his roster a little bit, and not like lose the locker room for the season kind of thing, but just in the flow of the game, have a little bit of infighting, have some confidence start to dip, things like that, and you could see things start to fall apart on the other side. And turning point 3 here for Georgia, really, if 1 and 2 happen, 3 is almost guaranteed, and that can really skew hard. Things could really start to fall apart for Oregon at that point, particularly if Lanning makes a couple bad clock management choices or things like that. Just, he's a first-time head coach. These things happen. When Kirby was a first-time head coach at Georgia, he made lots of bad clock management decisions, lots of bad just game management choices, and those cost you in the long run, especially in close games. So that is turning point 3 for Georgia. Now, on the Oregon side, turning point 1 has to be Bo Nix. He's the biggest, most important factor in this game. If Bo Nix can do some magical stuff, which he has done in the past, he struggled with Georgia, but really Bo Nix's game is running around doing some crazy stuff and pulling stuff out of his butt, to be honest. I mean, if he can, every now and then, he'll just break 3 sacks and throw a 40-yard bomb down the field for a touchdown. If he can do stuff like that and get you some explosive points manufactured out there, which we talked about Oregon struggling with last year, if Bo Nix can do that, with the help of his new offensive coordinator, if Bo Nix can do that, things start to look a lot more feasible for Oregon. You know, if they can get a couple big points just on an explosive play here or there, things look much more reasonable for them. If Bo Nix doesn't turn the ball over, if he has time to throw, things like that, if he's on his game, he gives Oregon a chance to win. Now, if he's not, Oregon has almost no shot to win. He is the most important individual player in this game, in my opinion. So that's why he's turning point 1 for Oregon. Second for Oregon has to be Lanning's defense. We've talked about it a lot at this point. How good are they going to be? They have to get Georgia uncomfortable on offense. Make Stetson Bennett throw his way to a win here. He's known to, you get him under some pressure, you put him in a high-stakes game. He has a couple picks here and there. He's not interception prone necessarily, but Oregon's really good at forcing turnovers. I mean, you get some pressure on him, you get a turnover here or there, things all of a sudden can look really good. So Lanning's defense has to be good enough to keep them in this game. They cannot field the same kind of defense that they fielded last year, because if they do, they're going to have no hope here. That has to be a much improved defense. That's the huge turning point there. Last one, turnover battle. This is a game where Oregon is just not the better team in. If you don't believe me, look at the Vegas line. They are a 17-point underdog, which seems a little bit crazy, but they are a 17-point underdog. They need some turnovers to go their way. They need some bounce of ball plays. They need some special teams. They need something. So the turnover battle will be the best way for them to manufacture some possessions, get some extra points, and really swing momentum. If they win the turnover battle by 1, 2, even 3, things all of a sudden start to look really, really good for Oregon in that case. And that's the best way for them to really close the talent gap, make things a little bit ugly, force a turnover here or there. Oregon has a shot at that point. So that takes me to my final score prediction. And again, I mentioned Vegas has this as a 17-point game. They have Georgia 17-point favorite. They have the over-under at 52.5. I am almost on the head for exactly what Vegas has. I have Georgia winning this game 35-17. That is an 18-point differential for Georgia. That's almost exactly what Vegas has. And that's a 52 points scored. That's like exactly what Vegas has. So I'm right in line with them in this one. And it's not normally something I do, to be honest. But I feel pretty good about this. Now, again, this could kind of skew a little bit. If the turnover battle, for example, goes in Oregon's favor, this could get much closer. If Oregon's defense is not improved or Bo Nix struggles or things like that, if the turnover battle goes the other way, you can see this get really out of hand. I think you could easily see like a 28-17 or a 35-24, something in that range. I think it'll probably still be a 2-score game unless Oregon really wins the turnover battle or their defense is just vastly improved, more so than even I think they will be. But this is where I have it. I just don't think Lanning is going to be good enough in his first ever game as a head coach to go in Atlanta against his former team, against the defending national champions in a much better roster and get a win there with a brand new staff, a brand new quarterback. I just don't see it happening. And that's why I've got the game where I have it. It might end up being a little bit closer, but as you can see here in my confidence, I have it on a 1 to 10 on how confident I am in this prediction. I have this as a 7, so not extremely likely, but I feel pretty likely about this, and I feel pretty good that this one's going to happen. As far as Week 1 games go, at least. I mean, Week 1 games are always hard to predict. You haven't seen this team this year. You don't know what it's going to look like, especially with Oregon. Completely new football team. But based on what we think we know, I feel pretty good about this prediction at 35-17. So that'll do it for this one. Let me know down below in the comment section where you guys agree and or disagree with me on this prediction video, as well as who you have winning the game and what the score will be. As always, I am super interested to see you guys' feedback. I always love to hear what you guys have to think, particularly on prediction videos like this. Also, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more college football content in the future. I've got 2 more of these coming out this week, hopefully a bunch more coming out next week. Check out some of the other content on the channel if you haven't. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.